One big, I told you so. You say it to yourself and everyone you know. He woke to the echo of screams through the trees, and not as close the sound of fireworks in short bursts that would be cut off and continued from another source to shortly be cut off again. He tried to look around with his neck and his head, but he couldn't. He tried again with his eyes, and he saw in the low light of the lantern, or the 3 lanterns hanging from the center of the easy-up, that he was bound by his wrists and his ankles to one of the camping chairs with paracord, and his mouth was stuffed with a ball gag that smelled just like the girl's car, the scent mixing with the Sharpie all over his face and arms, still wet, or maybe wet again in some places, and staining the chair, his boots still on. Of course his boots were still on. At least he hadn't pissed himself. Yet, he thought, as he tried not to lose his head. A light could be seen from inside one of the tents, bordering the easy-ups, but for his own life he couldn't remember whose. He let out a stifled combination of a grunt, yell, and a cry, but no movement from the tent was detected. If there were shadows in there, they were fast asleep. A plopping sound onto the roof of the easy-up. He could sense the ceiling of the tarp drooping drastically as puddles it held from earlier in the night spilled over the sides. More fireworks went off, but this time he realized no glow was coming from the sky or the trees. From his peripheral appeared one of the worms, spiraling down the leg of the easy-up from the tarp above, looking like something between a leech and an eel, but as wide as his leg at its widest. Everything smelled like iron and fish. The teeth. Where were the eyes? He started shaking, almost convulsing, whimpering behind the gag, trying to force his tongue around it just to scream, just to gasp more air to scream again, but louder, and he knew this cheap piece of shit had a breaking point. As he squirmed and flexed his jaw, he saw through the blur the worm corkscrew down the white metal leg and began to slither up one of his boots. It was large enough to wear one. Screaming through his nose, he shook violently to one side, then hard to the other in an attempt to free himself from the camping chair, which was just one of those $15 Coleman foldable joints you got at Walmart. One thrust to the left had him freed from his upright position and left him sideways on the ground, the worm turning its slither to focus on his face, all but thanking him for saving him the climb. Still no eyes could be seen, but the nostrils above the circular maw seemed to flare with anticipation as the creature eased up to his face at a closeness reserved for lovers, and began to masticate, and drool like some wicked, toothed asshole. Let's do that line again. One thrust to the left had him freed from his upright position and left him sideways on the ground, the worm turning its slither to focus on his face, all but thanking him for saving it the climb. Still no eyes could be seen, but nostrils above the circular maw seemed to flare with anticipation as the creature eased up to his face at a closeness reserved for lovers and began to masticate and drool like some wicked, toothed asshole. He screamed through the gag, snorting until it was hard to breathe, the back of his palate already raw from the night's festivities, the creature rearing back in a mimicry of, or maybe actual surprise. Or was it disgust? He shook the constraints wildly back and forth until one leg was free, and he hobbled a few feet into the darkness away from the worm, the ruined camping chair hanging from him in tatters, looking in the shadows like something damned. He put his foot against the armrest that was still connected to his left hand and pushed hard. A crack was heard by only him and the worm, and his foot came down into a rut dug for some reason along the back of the tents, and the bones broke into parts within his skin. He rolled onto the mud, the camping chair gathering around him like tattered bat wings, but through the mess he reached up and finally pulled the gag away, flinging it into the darkness. He screamed, and it hurt to do so. He tasted blood. He cried and scuttled and worked his good leg out of the tatters. He couldn't run or even walk. He just kept falling on the broken ankle. He tried using the trees for support. They fell out of the trees. More worms were dropping down from the branches into the mud. They were fast in the mud. They were faster than him anyway. Again he fell, palms first, into a mud puddle, something sharp piercing his left hand, causing him to rapidly pull it up and check. Stuck in the palm of his hand was a pin that must have fallen off one of the festival goers over the weekend. It featured Ren and Stimpy with tabs of acid on their tongues, their eyes done out in rainbows of cartoonized implied hallucinations. He thumbed the pin out of his palm and into the puddle, it creating a brown ripple, overlapping with the handful of ripples that he hadn't noticed gathering around him in a full circle, their slimy black hides dipping in and out of the mud, looking like not 5 or 6, but one large serpent. Morning was just beginning to bathe the campground in a semi-visible twilight, and pockets of carnage could be seen in all directions. Firelight began to the east, near the parking area, and small pops and then larger explosions could be heard. Screaming became louder and closer. Screaming started to muffle and seemed to suffocate. Jesus Christ, tongue twisters, I write. Excuse me. Screaming became louder and closer. Screaming started to muffle and seemed to snuff itself out. The worms were all over him now. He had pissed himself, but he was kneeling in a puddle. What did it matter? He could feel that they were strong, and as they coiled around his limbs, one of them was so long and large it coiled around his torso twice and under his left arm and had its face right up to his. He said please over and over again to some god he hadn't previously paid much thought. He whimpered in a way that only dying men He said please over and over again to some god he hadn't previously paid much thought. He whimpered in a way only dying or men holding their dying whimper. The nostrils above the worm's maw flared, little strings of slime flinging in and out with each breath. Breath. Breathe. He let out a sigh, and the creature again, or like the last one, reared back in what was now clearly visible as disgust. It was disgusted. He continued to exhale at the creatures, even giving a little ha sound behind it, painting the creatures with a warm, drunken breath, and they really did back off, scuttling wearily out of the puddle but still cautiously circling him. He coughed and sputtered in one of his bursts, and that sent one of them back even further. He started hawking and spitting at them, and he hated it. He started hawking and spitting at them, and they hated it. And some of the smaller ones retreating up into the trees, spiraling up the smaller trees, and using what he had just noticed to be small arm-like appendages at the creature's front half, in combination with their muscular tails to climb back into the boughs of the trees. The larger one had uncoiled from him and dipped back into the watery mud puddle, flopping and writhing and rolling and hissing, seemingly cleansing itself of his putrid breath. A breeze came, and upon it the scent of a busy gun range, and also the scent of melting plastic or vinyl. Through the mirage of the melting sea of tents, some rising with their shapes of the figures inside as the vinyl and their skin became one, the silver-suited men could be seen sweeping the path with the Ghostbuster gear throwing hell across the earth. What was left in him to scramble away was gone, and he didn't want the worms to give chase again at his movements, so he just sat there in the mud, his palm and foot and everything else thrumming with pain. They hadn't all dispersed, but were now some warily circling him and looking, not looking, some other sense, down the path at the encroaching fire men. Although they still circled him, their attention and gaze was upon them, the men, the Silvers. He wouldn't have shouted for their help in any case, not to disturb the creatures in the mud, but also it seemed to him that these men were not here to help the average Wook. One tent between him and their party that was not yet on fire began to jostle, and from the slit that was already open for ventilation emerged the top half of a naked man, blinking his eyes to the first shaft of the morning light through the trees, his bearing just acquired by himself and the encroaching team simultaneously. The crackling of radio static was heard from one, then, as though in reply from another, who nodded his head, retracted his hands from his flamethrower, which was held to him by a harness, and unslung his rifle. Just as the emerging Wook noticed the gun, the man in silver pulled the trigger from the hip, not even pausing to situate his visor eye level with the weapon. The Wook was torn apart by a hail of metal and slumped back into the tent, which collapsed underneath him. The pile of green vinyl began to writhe, and from within it the voice of a woman screaming and retching and again screaming a man's name. By this point the team of Silvers had reached the barrier of logs that separated this particular ring of tents from the main path, and the one who had gained just a bit more quickness in his step upon hearing the woman put one foot on the log and, kneeling over it, torched the whole circle of tents until it looked no more than a burning pile of tires. The Silver stepped down from the log in a motion that emanated some victory, but just so, his visor aimed at the man kneeling in the mud puddle and the giant black leeches circling him, and he pointed to get his team's attention on the scene as well. The whole team of 4 showed visible panic and straightened up as though caught doing something they should not have been. All 4 of them had their throwers up and aimed at the scene, which was now only about 30 feet down the path from them and slightly along a tributary path a few blocks from the sea of tents. Their line of sight only gave them a slight view of the worms, but their presence changed the behavior of the Silvers drastically. It seemed to him, from his position in the puddle, that they had just no idea how to approach. It didn't matter, because just then from the trees, smaller worms began to fall and forced them to run in the direction of the large ones encircling the Wook. One of the Silvers pulled the trigger, the strung wire like a bowstring the user squeezed on his flamethrower. Sorry, I'm fucking up here. Let's try that again. One of the Silvers pulled the trigger, the strung wire like a bowstring the user squeezed on his flamethrower too late, as one of the worms was already sailing for his head. Upon hitting the visor, it cracked with a sound like there must have been a beak of some kind behind the worm's circular toothed maw, and with almost no struggle, the worm had the front half of itself through the plate of the visor, and one more crack was heard. The man's skull. The man's arms, which had been flailing to try to grasp the wriggling thing, went slack, and he fell down into a kneeling position, not unlike the Wook in the puddle just a few blocks away. His head still lolled a bit with the creature's wriggling, and a few beats later the visor cracked further at a muscular thrust, which at first looked like the creature being stuck in its reverse. A bulge went through its elongated form, and all the way to a slit just before its tail tapered off into a fin-like shape to end it, where it shat, far from any evidence of digestion, most of the Silver's brain matter, along with fragments of his skull, into the muddy ground, and writhed the rest of itself into the room it had made, disappearing into the Silver's face, making itself at home.